All right, guys, what is up? Welcome to the 68th installment of the Play to Win podcast. We're going to be talking today with my good friend George Gammon about what's up with the economy. And normally I get guys to do like an elevator pitch because I know that not everybody's totally familiar with, my guests. But I think somebody dropped this in the chat before we got started. And this guy, Nathan, said, excited for the conversation. George's whiteboard videos are more informative than any economics class I've taken by a country mile. Um, I think
I actually get that quite a bit. Yeah.
I think that's a pretty solid way to sort of like, summarize George Gammon. But why don't you give him the quick elevator pitch and, let him know who you are and how you got into what you're doing? Because I mean, like your channel, I noticed in the description, in the about section, you use the word red pill when it comes to economics, which I thought was interesting because I don't think I've seen too many guys use that before. But yeah, let's let people know who you are and how you got there.
Well, it's the same thing, Rich. It's seeing the code in the matrix, right? I mean, you say that all the time, and I'm obviously a huge fan of yours and a huge fan of Rolo's. And whenever you see that or use that phrase, seeing the code in the matrix, it applies to economics and finance just as much as it applies to dealing with women and the sexual dynamics that you guys talk about all the time. But the backstory is first and foremost, I've never taken an econ class in my life.
Mm-hmm.
I've never taken a finance class. I almost flunked out of high school, and I got very poor grades, to say the least. But in 2012, I retired. I was an entrepreneur for many years, and had some businesses that failed, like everyone else does, and had a couple that did all right. And the business I retired from had over 100 employees, and I had a little bit of money saved up, enough to where I didn't have to go back to work again, as long as I could get maybe a 5% return. So I wanted to figure out how to invest my own money. I didn't want to delegate that to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And but I didn't know anything about investing. I knew a lot about business. I knew how to make money, but that is a completely different skill set from investing. I didn't know what the bond market was. I didn't know what the Federal Reserve was. I mean, none of the just basics. So I started watching YouTube videos, oddly enough, and went to Milton Friedman, Free to Choose, and I started studying Thomas Sowell and Jim Rogers and Jim Grant, Jim Rickards, Peter Schiff, Doug Casey, Rick Rule. And I really resonated with Jim Rogers. I said, okay, well, that's what I want to do. And this was 2012. So I wanted to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they're expensive. And so at the time, real estate was really cheap. So I kind of dove headfirst into the real estate game and bought a bunch of properties in Kansas City. And then I started doing that in South America, in Ecuador and Colombia. And I've been investing in real estate in Medellin, Colombia since 2015. And then in 2019, I did a TV show down there, just one of these HG TV shows where they follow me around into the properties that we're remodeling and rehabbing and then renting out or selling. And it went great. I was the executive producer. I was in the show. We did a season down there. And from season 1 to season 2, we had a break. So I wanted to leverage the staff I had. And so I started the YouTube channel. And I didn't think anyone would want to watch a video on economics, although that was my main passion. I love real estate, but my passion is economics and macro more specifically. So the first few videos we did were on real estate. No one watched them. You get like 10 views and 9 of them are from your mom or your sister or something like that. you know how it goes when you start
it's
the
crickets,
channel.
man. It's crickets for the first bit.
But then I did a couple videos on macro, and those were the ones that really blew up. So it was a great fit, and I just stuck with it. And after 6 or 7 months, I had maybe 100,000 subscribers or so. And now, after a couple years, we've got 300 and maybe 60 or 70,000 subscribers on the George Gammon channel. That's where I do most of the whiteboard videos. And then I just started the other channel called Rebel Capitalist, where I just do live streams on the daily news, and that's up to maybe 60 or 65,000 subscribers now. We've got the podcast, which is called the Rebel Capitalist Show. That's doing very well in the business and investing category in iTunes. So I just love doing it. I love talking to people like you and Peter Schiff. And fortunately, all those guys that I really looked up to and learned from, I've been able to actually interview for the show. So it's been a ride. I absolutely love it. And I just wake up every morning and just super excited.
Yeah, I've watched a few of them. I used to listen to Peter Schiff's podcast probably around 2013.
Mm.
He always had an interesting take.
Yeah, I actually just got off the phone with him
Yeah.
about 10 minutes ago. He called me up. He's in Connecticut, and he was talking to me about some things he thought I should have added to one of my whiteboard videos.
Oh,
You should have said this. You should have said this. You should have said this. And then he wants to do a debate with our good friend Brent Johnson on the dollar. So I'm going to set that up in the channel in the next couple of weeks.
I get that all the time. People telling me that I should have included something in a
Yeah,
video or
yeah,
a
yeah.
chapter in my book that I didn't, and it's like, well, okay. You know what I was thinking about when you were kind of doing your elevator pitch is, we kind of have a similar story because it was around 2012 that I started to get in the exit kind of space from my debt relief business,
Yeah.
and
I think we're the same age too, Rich.
yeah, and it wasn't the housing market, that I was looking into at the time because I was a little delayed until about 2015, and the full exit was around 2018 or so. But how would you compare running a company of 100 employees to trying to figure out the direction of the economy and where to place your bets with your own money, right? Like this is money that you've earned, paid taxes on, and you want to deploy to go to work for you. What's that like trying to figure out the economy versus trying to figure out how to run a business? Like how would you compare the two? Like are there similarities? Are there differences?
Oh, complete opposites. As a business, you're babysitting, especially when you got 100 employees and you're managing people. You're trying to problem solve just constantly putting out fires. And then you're trying to take charge and grow the business in whatever way that you can and try to seize opportunity. But in investing, number one, you don't have to deal with employees. And number two, instead of having that offensive approach with investing, you got to have a defensive approach first and foremost. You've got to manage risk. And the number one rule in investing is just make sure you stay in the game. And Warren Buffett says the top three things to remember in investing is don't lose money, and don't lose money.
Mm.
And as you know, as an entrepreneur, you don't have that mindset. You have an abundance mindset. And like I said earlier, you're always looking for opportunities to start a new business, to create a new revenue stream. And you've got to be willing to take an acceptable amount of risk, and often risk that other people would see as excessive. And in proper now speculation or speculating is different. I think there's a component of risk there that's acceptable. But if you're just investing and just trying to make a 10 or 12% return and maintain your purchasing power first and foremost, you've got to be always focused on your downside, always focused on risk management instead of an entrepreneur. You're always trying to focus on the upside.
And when it comes to putting money into the markets wherever you deploy it, I mean, do you just sort of dollar cost average in throughout the months and years, or do you look
No.
for buying opportunities when there's blood in the street?
Yeah, the latter.
Blood in the
So
streets.
I've always, but this is different, based on objectives and your personality. You've really got to know yourself well
Yeah.
as an investor. You got to know what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, but you need to do that in entrepreneurship as well. But I really just don't, I tried not to do anything. Going back to Jim Rogers, one of his famous lines is he always said that you got to just wait and sit on your hands, be very, very patient. And when a pile of money is sitting in the corner, just go pick it up and then come back to your chair. And in the interim, do nothing. And sometimes you go a year, you go 2 years without seeing a pile of money show up in the corner, but that's fine. That's okay. So many people have this itch to keep doing things, and usually that's counterproductive. So as an example, one of the first times I actually bought shares was back in 2013 when Cyprus had the bail-ins. I don't know if you remember that when when they had their banking crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and they actually took depositors' money, and their stock market went down by 99%.
Mm.
And you could go in there and buy publicly traded shares of hotels, as an example. Cyprus is a big tourist destination, and they were just trading for pennies, and you could get like a 10, 15% dividend yield. So I went and did that, just took advantage of crisis investing, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never sold the shares. I still have them today. And then another example, in March of 2020, when the market was just in dire straits because of we'll call it the cerveza sickness.
Mm-hmm.
There's fear, there's panic. That's another indicator I like to use when, as far as on the buy side, is when there's panic. You always want to get greedy, and I was buying when oil was down under $20 a barrel. I was buying oil producers when oil was negative $38 a barrel, if you remember that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was buying uranium. I was buying a lot of the commodities because at the time and to this day, I think that we've gone into a commodities super cycle, which usually lasts about 10 to 15 years. The last one started in 96, 98 and ended in 2011. And I think that we went into another one in 2020, and we'll probably be in this bull market super cycle until 2030, 2035. Now, that's not to say that there isn't volatility. There's always extreme volatility where prices will go way, way up and then they'll come crashing down. But that's what you use as your buying opportunity and kind of buy around that long-term view. But you got to be patient to add to your position. I think now is a great time, or a great example. We've got oil at $110 a barrel. And anytime oil gets over 80 or 85, adjusted for inflation, it's pretty expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wanting to buy, and I did quite extensively when it was under $30 a barrel. And right now I'm not buying, definitely not selling, but I'm waiting for a pullback. If Russia, hopefully, the Russia-Ukraine thing comes to an end very quickly, I think that makes oil drop down to probably 80. That might be a buying opportunity. Or if we get a recession, we had the inversion of the yield curve in the United States with the Treasury market, the 2s and 10s, maybe 2 months ago. We had a negative GDP print for Q1 in the United States. We've got a lot of indicators that are screaming recession right now. So if we go into a recession, especially as the Fed is raising interest rates, that could be very bearish for commodities. But again, I think that's a buying opportunity if you've got that long-term 10 to 15-year time horizon where we're in this super cycle. And you saw those stages and those fluctuations in price in the last one we went through from 96 to 2011 as well. So that's kind of the way I like to do things. Another example of just buying cheap and selling expensive is when I bought real estate in 2012, I wasn't trying to figure out the price. And this is something I learned from Jim Rogers as well, is I don't think that's a prudent strategy and that's what most people do first and foremost, is they try to ask themselves, well, what's the price going to do, right? If I'm buying a home in 2012, do I think the prices are going to go up, or do I think they're going to go down? If the prices are going to go down, then I'm going to hold off and not buy. If the prices are going to go up, then I'm going to go ahead and buy now. And I don't think that's the right approach. Instead, you've got to just ask yourself a simple question: is it cheap? If it's cheap, buy it, regardless of which direction you think the price is going. And if it's expensive, sell it. So in 2012, I thought the prices most likely were going to continue to go down, but I bought anyway because it was cheap. And then I just sold my last property in the United States a couple months ago. Now, that's not because I think the market's going to crash. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But the market could go up it could triple from here. Who knows? But I don't care about that because I'm just selling because it's expensive, regardless of which direction I think the price is going to go. And I think if you continue to do that and you're agnostic as far as the commodity, or excuse me, you're agnostic as far as the types of assets you're willing to invest in and where you're willing to invest. You just do that over and over and over again. And I think that's an edge. And if you do that over the long term, I think you're going to come out a winner.
What about the dollar cost average guys that are all about time in the market rather than timing the market? Because you basically summarized your strategy and timing the market. Have you considered that investment strategy?
Yeah, I don't like that because I could show you so many examples of when the market goes down and doesn't come back up.
Hmm.
So now, if you're buying cheap, then it's just kind of a waiting game and you're minimizing your downside. But that's not to say that you get every investment right. Again, that's a numbers game. You're going to get maybe 60% of them right, 40%, but you just got to ride your winners and you got to cut your losers short. But as far as just blindly buying, regardless of whether things are expensive or cheap, just because we've had a slight pullback, again, I don't like that. If you look at Japan as an example, back in 1990, their real estate market and their stock market went down by 50, 60%. And to this day, in nominal terms, it has not, quote unquote, recovered. So, it's a fallacy to think that the stock market just always goes up over time. You hear that from financial advisors
Hmm.
that are young or are kind of trying to sell you some oceanfront property in Arizona by just showing you charts from 1981 to today's date. Why do they do that? Because we've been in a down cycle in interest rates. Interest rates have gone from 18 or 19% all the way down to 0%. Okay, well, in that environment, sure, stocks are going to go up, but interest rates are cyclical. So, and they're usually run in 30 or 40-year cycles. So what
Hmm.
happens when we go into the next cycle of 30 or 40 years and interest rates go back up to 18%? You cannot expect for stocks to continue to go up. And if you look at a chart of the stock market, the S&P, from the late 1920s to about 1979 or 1980, and if you adjust for inflation, the stock market was flat.
Hmm.
It was flat from 1927 to 1980. So it's just that these last couple decades that people like to get hyper focused on, and they say, well, if you would have dollar cost average, well, sure, but you got to look at all of the price action throughout history. You can't cherry pick your time frame, and that's again why I like my strategy a little bit better when you're just buying things when they're super cheap, when they're unloved. One of the things that I'm really bullish on right now, maybe not at today's price, but over the long run, is coal. And most people would be super excited about Facebook or Tesla or something like that, Zoom maybe, some of these high flying tech stocks.
Hmm.
But when you mention coal, people just get this sour look on their face and they tell you that you're crazy. And usually when you get that response from people, it means you're going to make a lot of money. And and because why do they do that, Rich? Because they focus on the demand side of the equation. They forget about the supply side.
Yeah.
One of the best stories I ever heard from Jim Rogers was back in 2003. He was talking about the last bull market, the last super cycle in commodities. And one of his favorite commodities at the time was lead. And you're my age, so I'm sure you remember back in those days in the late 90s, lead was public enemy number one. I mean, it was all in the media that it was getting in kids like bloodstreams and it was messing them up and poisoning them. And people were, if it was in their paint, they were stripping off their paint and
Hmm.
redoing their house and all these things. I mean, no one wanted to touch lead, quite literally. And this was one of his favorite commodities. And people were telling him they were crazy. But his bullish argument is that, sure, the demand side is going to go down. Absolutely. But nobody is going to invest in companies that produce lead. Therefore, if there's no investment, they can't put any money towards increasing future supply. And if there's no future supply that comes online, even if the demand is cut in half, the price is still going to skyrocket. And if you look at a chart of lead from, call it 2002 to 2008 or 9, that's exactly what it did. It went parabolic. So I think that we could be in that same cycle with coal right now, even though the price has run and I'm not a buyer today.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. You're a car guy too, so I want to kind of take a minute to talk about this as well because I was watching this video the other day. It's on Doug DeMuro's channel, and he was talking
Oh, I
about
love Doug. That's one of my favorite channels.
yeah, the quirks and features guy, and
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what that is, man, but just going around the car and like pointing stuff out is it's just a cool, 20
And
minutes
he's
to
a
kill.
great personality too. At the end
He
of the
is,
day,
yeah.
that's what these YouTube channels are all about. People
Yeah.
just bonding with your personality.
Yeah, 100%. But speaking of the unloved and cars that would become future classics, one of the things that he was pointing out from past trends as well was certain vehicles that were unloved at the end of their product cycle. A real good example would have been like the last model years of the first gen Acura NSX, which I think went out of
Right.
production
Right.
in 2001, two, or three, or something like that. But nobody really liked them. It had no ability to compete with any of the exotic cars of its day, and they had a hard time getting rid of them. Same thing with the Ford GT back in 2004 to six, I think it was. They couldn't even get them off the lot. Same thing with the Lexus LFA. They were paying people to go around and show the car off at like Cars and Coffees to try to generate some interest so they could sell some. But all these cars are worth a vast fortune today. Like you could have bought a Ford GT only a few years
150
ago.
grand. I remember I was looking at one back in
Yeah, yeah,
2007 or so.
yeah. They're up over half a mil. 600, 700. Depending on the quality and the spec of the car. Same thing with the Acura NSX. They're selling for way more than what they were selling them for. Back in the day. So
You
he
know,
made a couple of interesting, predictions, and he was talking, essentially about things that weren't loved today that are limited production, performance cars that will probably have a lot of interest. You do the same thing, I think, with F-250 diesel trucks right now.
yeah, yeah. I just stumbled across that, and that's been a really fun thing to do. Is kind of like a little side hustle. I was down in Tucson helping out my younger brother, and I bought an Airstream, if you know what that is,
Hmm.
and one of those silver cylinder kind of American iconic RV trailer things. And I had never owned a truck. I didn't know the first thing about it, and so I bought a Ford F-150, and I very close to Mexico. So I'm like, oh, I'll buy one that's beat up, take it down to Mexico, get it fixed up, because I knew a bit of
Hmm.
Spanish, and it'd be a fun adventure. So I did that, and then I found out that the F-150 couldn't pull the trailer, so I had to sell it. I sold it in like 3 days, made like 2 or 3 grand. I'm like, well, this is fun, and I started to research these Power Stroke 7.3 diesels from '95 to 2002, a lot better, and I
Yeah.
found that they're in massive demand. So I started buying them and selling them on eBay just as I was down there helping out my brother. It was a fun thing to do,
Mm.
and I really enjoyed it. And I kept about, now I probably got 5 or 6 of them in storage that are like 60, 70,000 original miles on them. And I just keep them as a store of value, just like I'd keep a bar of gold, just kind of as insurance, because I know that they'll always maintain their value relative to inflation. Another thing that I wanted to point out, though, Rich, what you're saying, those cars that are unloved. Remember when the Gallardo first came out?
Yeah.
And I bought one back in, I think they first came out in 2004, and I bought one in like 2006. But back then, the paddle shifters were really, that was the hot thing, and no one wanted a stick shift. And then remember the Ferrari, what was it? The
F-430.
435 was the last one that they had, or the F430, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
was the last one that they made with the stick. And
Actually, the
everyone,
last Ferrari they made with a stick was a California, believe it or not.
oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Apparently, there's a handful of Californians out there with a manual transmission.
I never knew that. But
Yeah.
but remember back then that the paddle shifters were
Yeah.
really the thing, and no one wanted the sticks.
Yeah, I've heard stories about dealers calling like people on the waiting list for cars and saying, "Hey, we got a manual transmission car in. I know you want a e-gear on order. Do you
Yeah,
want this manual?" And they couldn't sell them. Like nobody would take them.
yeah. And now those sticks are literally double the value.
Yeah,
Like if you go buy an F430, you get one for 130 grand. If you can get a stick, it's like $250,000.
yeah,
And I would assume it's the same thing with the Lamborghinis. I know it's definitely that way with the Murcielagos.
yeah, yeah. It's crazy. Yeah, there's a guy with a YouTube channel, Damon Fryer, Daily Driven Exotics. He had a gated manual Murcielago, and I think it was like one of six
Mm,
in the world. Like that's even like that's rarer than a Zonda, Bugatti, like pretty much any other
yeah.
production car, because most of them were e-gear,
Yep. Yep.
transmissions. I know that we're probably baffling some people on the topic of cars, but George might geek out on that. Let's go back to what's going on with the economy. One of the more popular videos on your channel, it's got almost 700,000 views on it, and the title is "The Global Elite's Great Reset Agenda."
Uh,
Can you talk a little bit about and that video is about a year old, so maybe you can kind of like update some thoughts on that, today, on what you think's going on with guys like Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and the Great Reset. What are your
Sure.
thoughts on that?
Well, I actually just did a presentation on this at Mark Moss's event in Dallas, so it's kind of fresh on my mind. And I think, to make a short story long here, you've got to start by going back to 1513, the year. And this is when Machiavelli wrote his book called The Prince. And if any of your viewers or listeners haven't read the book, or at least watched like a documentary, you got to do it.
The book's
It's
called The Prince.
The Prince. Yeah, it's only about 90 pages.
Okay.
And basically, back then, kind of the mainstream narrative, if you will, is that what made a good leader or a king or a prince was integrity, was honesty,
Mm-hmm.
was virtue, all of these things. And Machiavelli was the first one that came out and said, you're lying to yourself. That the way you stay in power as a politician is by doing the opposite of that. If you want to do good, you've got to be willing to be bad. Ethically, you got to abandon all morals. You've got to be willing to go against your word. You've got to be ruthless. You have to do these things, or else you're A, not even going to get into power, and B, if you get there, you're not going to keep your position of power. So, fast forward to the 1900s, and several of the dictators were very, very influenced by Machiavelli. Hitler, Stalin, just to name a few. John Gotti used to reference The Prince all the time.
Mm.
And it had a massive impact on a gentleman by the name of Henry Kissinger. So much so that one of the more recent versions of The Prince, it's still in print today, the cover of it has Henry Kissinger on the cover.
Mm.
And so now we go to 1967, and Klaus Schwab takes a class or a seminar from Kissinger at Harvard, and he said that was one of the greatest impacts on his life. And Kissinger back then was saying things like, one of his famous quotes, like, if you control the food, you control the people. If you control the energy, you control countries. If you control money, you control the world. And so then you've got Klaus saying that Kissinger was one of the biggest influences on his entire life. Now we go back a little bit to the 1800s, and there's another gentleman there by the name of Thomas Malthus. And so if you've ever heard the term Malthusian, it started with Thomas Malthus, and he was the first one to really articulate this view, where if the global population increased exponentially, that would lead to significant problems because we live in a world of limited resources. And so he actually argued for, controlling the birth rate,
Mm-hmm.
put it mildly, maybe even depopulating. He argued why war was a good thing, because it would wipe out half the population. And that's better because now we're not constrained by we're temporarily dodged a bullet as far as being constrained by the resources relative to the population. I mean, these are things that he would say out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And since then, it's been very popular with the intellectual elite, right? So you fast forward to 1968, there's a group that was set up called the Club of Rome. And they're basically just taking Malthus ideas and just kind of repackaging them for the modern age. And Klaus Schwab was very, very moved and influenced by the Club of Rome as well, to the point where in 1972, he set up the World Economic Forum in 1971.
Mm-hmm.
It was called something different. But in 72, he had the gentleman who set up the Club of Rome to do a speech on his most recent paper called Limits to Growth. And I'm sorry, the paper came out in 72. He did the speech at the World Economic Forum in 73. So limits to growth became kind of a worldwide phenomenon. And again, it was just regurgitating these ideas, these Malthusian ideas. And so much so that MIT actually turned it into a computer program where they projected the end of the world based on human population growth, pollution, and damage to the environment. Mm-hmm. And then in 91, the Club of Rome, which still exists today, came out with another paper that was wildly popular that kind of re-articulated their views, but then said the only solution is not at a local level. It's not at an individual level. It's not at a state level. It's not at a country level. The only way you're going to solve this is through central planning and basically a global government. And this echoed a lot of the thoughts from Henry Kissinger as well. So then when you fast forward to today, and I'm sure a lot of your viewers have seen the clips of Bill Gates talking about how there's a big problem with the population going from 7 billion up to 9 billion or 12 billion. Mm-hmm. And this is just him looking at the Club of Rome and being influenced by Klaus Schwab. And this is just a Malthusian idea that he also is taken to heart and really thinks that, sure, okay, Malthus kind of got it wrong in the 1800s. We figured out some solutions there. And maybe the Club of Rome was early, but by 2050, this is definitely going to impact the world. So, being a megalomaniac and these people thinking that they are superior genetically and intellectually to the other 7 billion people on Earth, they figure that if they can't solve the problem, then we can't solve the problem collectively either. The free market cannot do this. So you've got two options. Either you reduce the energy use or you reduce the birth rate, or ideally you do both. Mm-hmm. And that's why when you look at everything that's happening in the world, whether it's the Great Reset agenda, whether it's the government's response to, we'll call it the cerveza sickness, keep it YouTube friendly, mm-hmm. Even right there, Trudeau, Trudeau is just a pawn of Klaus Schwab. I mean, the way you know this is because when you hear Klaus Schwab speak and hear Trudeau speak, he uses the exact same words. It's like it's a script that they're given. And
it's a dead giveaway.
Yeah, exactly. And Biden does the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So we go into this world where we are today, where you're looking at what they're doing. And I would go so far as to say Russia as well. You look at that, and you look at this push towards wokeism as another thing. And this is something that I've seen very, very few people connect the dots, and it's definitely applicable to your channel. You talk about this all the time. But I think that one of the reasons the global elite, and now they're in bed with the corporations as well, one of the reasons why they're pushing this woke agenda so much is because it reduces the birth rate. And if you just look at their three main objectives, and I've kind of done a lot of thinking on this, and I think you can really summarize it by saying, the reduction in energy, like we're saying, the reduction in the birth rate, and then usurping power, control, and wealth. So if you look at either a woke agenda
through softens the population and it makes it more compliant too.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that their reaction to the cerveza sickness was a big step forward for them to condition people to basically believing in absurdities. You look at all the absurdities throughout the mainstream narrative right now, and the more you can get people to believe in what is just ridiculous, the more power and control you have over their daily life. And even looking at what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, why is it that the media is just so hell bent on the U.S. getting involved with Russia? Why isn't it something like Afghanistan, or why isn't it something that where the media is not paying as much attention to it like they have in wars in the past? And you say, oh, it's about Putin invading a democratic society. Okay. I think if you look at the propaganda around this, and we see it recently with this push towards Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and I think that it's because the global elite want the United States to get involved because it helps them achieve those three objectives. Look at it through that lens. Is it going? Look what's happening in Europe right now. They're having to ration natural gas. They're having to ration energy use. They're having to ration electricity. Okay, what's objective number one? Check that box. Okay, we go into a nuclear war. Okay, check box number two. Decreases the birth rate in the population, that's for sure. And then if we go into a war, who are the entities that benefit from that? It would be the global elite, the politicians. The people are the ones, especially the poor and middle class, that always end up paying the price. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're behind everything. But the title of my presentation at Mark's event was "Never Let a Crisis Go to Waste."
Mm.
And I think that they've got these objectives, and then when a crisis presents itself, they sit back and say, okay, we influence this politician, this corporate head, this CEO, this hedge fund manager, these people that come to Davos. So, and this, mainstream media outlet. So how can we position a narrative around this crisis and implement policy that'll help us achieve one, two, or all three of those objectives we just outlined?
You're very articulate at presenting that information without causing any issues on YouTube. I commend you for that.
I've had a lot of practice, Rich.
I want to ask you now. So now that you've sort of explained that, how are you hedging your bets to profit and survive that economic and change in the world that you see coming?
It goes right back to commodities. Because in that world where, one of their main things obviously is climate change. And I'm not someone that's going to say that climate change is right or wrong or man-made or not man-made. Your audience can decide that for themselves.
Let's just agree on that. Yeah.
But I can tell you that the global elite don't care about polar bears.
Right.
They don't care about the temperature in the ocean. It's all just a ruse. It's a Trojan horse to help them achieve those Malthusian objectives and the power, control, and wealth. And then we go back to the Kissinger quote, how do you control countries? Well, you control the energy. And how do you control the population? You control the food. And we can see that kind of play out with all the food shortages and energy prices going sky high. And then with them, again, controlling that narrative, which I think they're going to do more and more through this quote unquote disinformation. Mm-hmm. And this basically war on freedom of speech and this push towards censorship. But that's, kind of a completely separate topic. But if you look at, how they're trying to get from A to B with the Green New Deal, as an example, with trying to completely stop using fossil fuels, which goes right back to lead, remember, and the whole ESG movement. Well, why is it that, or one of the reasons, I'll say, not the entire reason, but one of the main reasons why energy prices are so high today is because of the ESG movement, because no capital went into sourcing more supply. So sure, you can sit there and say how dirty coal is. And sure, you can sit there and say how we shouldn't invest in natural gas. And then you can sleep well at night. You can look yourself in the mirror and pat yourself on the back thinking that you're doing good. But at the end of the day, that's going to mean much, much, much higher prices. And that's going to mean that the poor and the middle class suffer to a greater degree. And that means lower GDP growth. And that means that the standard of living for society goes down because energy is the economy. If you looked at a chart, Rich, of the global population, you'll see it just kind of exponential growth like that. But if you put that up against a chart with GDP does the same thing, but do that with energy use. Mm-hmm. And energy does the exact same thing. So if you don't have that energy increasing at the same rate, you cannot increase GDP, and that's going to lower the standard of living. But my point there is everything that they're pushing as far as their narrative is going to lead to higher and higher commodity prices, not just with energy, coal. Uranium is another thing that I really, really like right now. Mm-hmm. But it's also going to lead to the soft commodities increasing in price because, unfortunately, we're going to see massive shortages. I mean, look at what's happening in Sri Lanka right now. Their government is completely imploding because they can't get diesel. They just cannot get fuel because they don't have the dollars for a variety of different reasons. But I think that's going to get a lot better that's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. So if you want an investment theme around the Great Reset agenda, it would be buy commodities, but maybe not now. Wait till there's panic, wait till the price really goes down and use that as a buying opportunity for this, what I think will contribute to this long-term super cycle.
What are the commodities that you like the best? You talked about uranium, coal. Is there
those are the two I like the best, coal and uranium.
And you like uranium for the purpose of nuclear power plants?
Yeah, because I think that's going to be their only option. And you
It
can
really
already
has
see
been
that.
their only option. Like I find it's funny when you see these like guys that think that electric cars are the solution, and they think that there's like fields of windmills and solar panels that are collecting the electricity to charge up these cars. But they don't realize like probably 95% of the electricity comes from coal and whatever nuclear plants are still running. But I think there's a lot of people that are afraid of nuclear still. Although you're right, it's really the only prudent source of hardcore, reliable energy that's relatively cheap and safe. Even though a
Yeah,
lot
and
of people still don't think
ironically
it's
enough,
safe.
it's a lot greener than
It is. It's very
something
green.
like natural gas or something that we've tried to replace it with.
Biomass has been a big one that's been blowing up over the last few years, which is really just cutting down forests and burning the wood.
Yeah,
They
biofuels.
call it
Yeah,
they
you
call
know
it
what's
biomass to make it sound environmentally friendly, but it's just tearing down trees and burning them.
Yeah, yeah. One of the charts I've used to illustrate what we've been discussing quite extensively is a chart of energy use broken down by the specific energy source,
Hmm.
going back to like 1800. And it's that exponential, like we said. But back in 1800, like the number one source, probably 99% of our fuel came from biofuels. To your point, it was either lumber or dried cow dung,
Hmm.
really. And then we went to oil, petroleum. Then we go to coal, then natural gas, then wind, solar, and nuclear. But what you'll notice is that we never use less of the prior energy source. So, said another way, today in 2022, we are using more biofuel than we did in the year 1800
Yeah.
when it was 100% pretty much of the energy we used. We don't use less of it, we just use more and more and more, which allows the economy to grow and allows the standard of living to increase. So those people that say that we need to replace oil with solar, you don't know what you're talking about. We don't need to replace things. We need to make sure that our energy sources continue to grow exponentially. If we don't have that, then what you're going to have is just you're going to kill billions of people on Earth, and you're going to lower the standard of living for everyone else, and it's going to get really ugly really quick if you flatten out the energy source but yet keep the population growing exponentially. They've got that's one thing I'll give them credit for, like Bill Gates and Klaus. They've got the problem correct. It's
Hmm.
just their solution is wildly wrong.
Hmm.
My solution would be let the free market fix this. It's been fixing it since Malthus came out with his ideas in 1800. Because if the population goes from 7 billion to 9 billion, what Bill Gates forgets to tell you is that's an additional 2 billion people on this planet that can solve the problem. And if you just deregulate, if you just let the people, just do what they do and pursue their own self-interest, going back to Atlas Shrugged, you're going to solve these Malthusian problems. But it's not going to come from a top-down approach. It's got to be from a decentralized, bottom-up, free market capitalist approach.
Yeah, but you're asking these elites to step aside and let the markets do their thing, and they don't like doing that.
Yeah, yeah.
They're always going to
Well,
try to meddle.
it crushes their worldview because their
Yeah,
worldview is based pretty much in eugenics, with this idea that they are superior
yeah, they
in
think
pretty
they're
much every
gods.
way. So
Yeah,
if they can't solve the problem, there's no way they can expect anyone else to solve the problem because everyone else is inferior to them.
yeah, and I think it all is predicated on breeding fear, whether it's fear around the environment, climate change, the food, viruses.
Look
There's a
at
new
what they're
one.
doing to the free range chickens in
Yeah,
the United. Have you read into that? I mean, that is very disturbing. They're
yeah.
killing them by the millions because they're saying that they're scared of another, bird flu, and that it's like,
Well, we
really,
have a
are
new
we
one that
really
just came
scared of
out
that, or are you
recently.
just
I don't know
trying to
if you
make sure
heard the
people can't feed
monkeypox.
themselves?
I don't know if you heard about the new one that just came out. It's called the monkeypox.
I heard about that this morning somewhere. Yeah.
That's you guys are going to be hearing a lot about that over the next few weeks because the whole cerveza sickness has played itself out, and people aren't really buying it anymore, so they have to cook up a new one.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. Back to the commodities with coal and uranium. Are there any companies that you like? I have my pen ready so I can jot down and add it to my watch list.
No, I need to get back on that bandwagon. I've been so busy that back in March of 2020, I wanted to buy these things. So I bought just the ETFs because I didn't have time to research it. So I bought URA, which is an ETF for uranium. And I bought the coal ETF, which at the time was KOL, and it was paying like some outrageous dividend yield, like 15%. So with coal, what happened is it like tripled or quadrupled in price, but for some reason it was so unpopular that they stopped it. They just discontinued the ETF, and that's a great contrarian indicator in and of itself, right there. But now I'm looking for some other coal plays when they come down, but I don't have any specific ones. I would look at producers, maybe in the United States, but I hate to say Australia. Usually those are the ones that pay the great dividends. But I think people just have to do some homework there. Also, if you guys want to follow Chris McIntosh on Twitter, he's at Capitalist Exploits, I believe is his handle. He's one of the people I partner with in Rebel Capitalist Pro, and he's been a hedge fund manager for over 20 years, and he is really neck deep in the commodity space, especially with coal and uranium. And he has a lot of those specific companies that he suggests. As far as uranium, though, I can give you a good one there, and that would just be the Sprott Uranium Trust. And what's interesting is usually if you want to go long uranium, you've got to go through a producer, but you're taking on additional risk there because you've got a management team, you've got a capital structure, you've got you've got the risk of whatever country the uranium producer, maybe they nationalize the mine, who knows what happens. So you've got government risk there as well. But if you can actually buy the commodity itself, then you eliminate all that risk. That's the pure play. You go long uranium. Prior to Sprott setting up this trust, that wasn't possible. But now it is. You just buy shares of their trust. And what they do is they actually buy the physical uranium and they store it.
So you don't have to store a radioactive product in your
in your garage next to your McLaren 720. So I would look at Sprott Uranium Trust. Yeah.
Good tip. So Sam's asking a question. He says, George, what are your thoughts on Teespring and Redbubble? I'm not sure what's going on with those two. Do you know about that?
No, I don't know what those are.
Teespring's the company that YouTube bought they actually do my merch, so my mugs and my T-shirts and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's who Teespring is, but I've never heard of Redbubble. No,
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. It's for me. I don't really get into that stuff too much because it always seems like angel investing.
Okay.
Like I get those questions all the time. It's like, what do you think of XYZ company that doesn't have any revenues, that doesn't, or maybe have revenue, but doesn't have a lot of profit? Their upside is this, and this. And I say, yeah, it is. But again, you're angel investing, and I don't like to do that. I always say, Rich, that I like to buy $1 for 50 cents. I don't like to buy $1 for $5, hoping it goes to $10.
Yeah, I think it's in human nature, especially for like first-time investors. And I've made this, mistake. I remember back in the day, I can't remember when it was, but there was this diamond mine that was like, oh, this is going to be the next whatever, right? And
yeah, I don't like that stuff.
Tahara, TAH, I'll never forget the symbol, but I piled in a few $1,000s that I had sitting around. Is basically all that I had. I'm like, oh yeah, this will turn into $1 million. I'll use this to buy my, wealth and sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it all went to zero, of course. So like, whenever you see these like penny offerings or these small opportunities, it's like whenever somebody comes at me with these, what do you think of this chain and that chain on, the blockchain sort of thing? And it's like, I did a cast about this, the other day. And if you guys haven't watched it, you should definitely go back and watch the last Playing to Win from the prior week. But there's 19,500 cryptocurrencies, and most of them are all going to go to zero in the next few years. They don't have much of a use case. So, I mean, if you want to roll the dice and you think that, investing in something that is that speculative is going to make you wealthy, I wish you luck. That's just my take on it, though.
I always, like, as an entrepreneur, it was just always my nature to where I would rather buy a McDonald's than invest that $1 million in some sort of startup that didn't have any revenue or profit, but had just massive upside. I'll take the McDonald's every day of the week.
Yeah. definitely a sure thing. Pedro says, George, do you foresee China becoming the largest economy and controlling energy, birth rate, and money?
Probably not energy unless they partner up with Russia. And I think
They
that's
don't have a lot in the way of resources, do they? Natural resources?
well, not enough for 1.5 billion people.
Yeah.
They've got a lot of resources, but that's a huge population that you have to feed first and foremost. And so I think that's why they'll continue to be cozy with Russia. And that's another reason why I don't think it's a good idea for the United States to push the envelope there, because we are heavily dependent on China for most of the goods that we have in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a completely separate topic. The birth rate, I mean, they're trying to increase the birth rate right now. As far as energy, I think they're going to try to delegate that or offload that to their partnership with Russia. I mean, right now, all the oil that Europe is not buying, or the nat gas that Europe is not buying, China is buying at 50 cents on the dollar. So
I think I read somewhere today that they're building up strategic reserves at this point.
as they should. I
Right.
mean, as they should. That's the smart thing to do, especially when you're long dollars and you're short energy. That's a kind of a macro nerdy way of saying it. That just means that you've got a lot of dollar cash flow coming in because you export so much to the United States, and those exports are settled in dollars. But what you don't have a lot of is energy. So you need those dollars to buy the energy because global energy is also settled in dollars. But that's why this relationship with China, or excuse me, with Russia, I think is so important to them, and that's why it's hugely beneficial. The West's approach to these sanctions is so beneficial to China, is because again they're getting that energy that they so desperately need on the cheap, and they're
Mm.
storing it and they're saving it for a rainy day. I think that's maybe what might explain this, what seems to be irrational approach toward the cerveza sickness with these crazy lockdowns that they've had in areas like Shanghai. It seems like they may be trying to condition their society to get acclimated to living with less food and less energy if they have to cut off the dollar supply coming in from the United States. As far as money, yeah, I mean, they've come out with the digital yuan, and I think that they are going to try to uh, push their central bank digital currency. And I think one of the ways that they'll get mass adoption is through the One Belt, One Road initiative. So they've made all these investments across India, across Eastern Europe, and in Africa and South America. We've all heard of this. And I think that if they come out with a digital yuan, that is all currency is a liability of a bank, whether it's a central bank or a commercial bank. And the big difference there is a commercial bank has a P&L, so they have to be very selective about who they lend to. But a central bank doesn't really have a P&L. They do, but they can just print money. They don't really have to have positive equity. They can have negative equity. They can't go out of business, right? They can't go bust.
Mm.
So they can issue loans if these other countries have accounts, and these main corporations in other countries have accounts with the PBOC, which is their central bank. They can really determine who's getting credit, who's not getting credit, and they don't really have to worry about that P&L. And once the big corporations in these countries start using the digital yuan, then so will the consumers. And then you just kind of try to create this network effect. So that's not a prediction. But it is to say that I think this is one of their main objectives over the next 10 years, is to take control of money through the digital yuan, and they're creating that network through the One Belt, One Road initiative.
Speaking of China, there's a real chink in the armor. This is the Achilles heel that I see. That's a real problem for the economy and for stability in the world, because China's made it clear they want Taiwan.
Mm.
And I think it's something like 95% of chip production happens in Taiwan. Taiwan doesn't want to be a part of China.
Yeah.
Most of these high tech companies have well established businesses and production facilities that are really high tech that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And if you want like military grade chips, for things like computers, for military equipment, for anything that's high tech. I'm sure things like Tesla's, Apple phones, and all these things as well. That's where it comes from,
Yeah.
and that's going to mean that if China goes for Taiwan, the USA has to get involved, right? They can't hand over access to that technology and those production facilities to China. That's going to be a real problem. I don't know how much you know about the details of that, but it's a pretty significant risk as I see it. Do you have any comments on that?
I thought that there was a decent probability that China would go after Taiwan right when Russia went into
I
Ukraine.
thought so too.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
thought that let's watch Taiwan here. Fortunately, that didn't happen because I
yeah, they're
don't
not.
want things to escalate.
And I mean, the
But
other problem that China has too is they actually have a very short timeline. Like they legitimately have to do this within the next 5 years. Otherwise, they won't have the resources and manpower to take back Taiwan.
yeah, well, that's they may though because if you look at China's demographics, it is true that they've got a big problem there, just like
Hmm.
Japan. Maybe not to the extent that Japan has it, but they've got a big problem there where they've got a lot more old people than they have young people coming up to replace them. But if they are able to continue to urbanize and grow their economy, you're pulling so many poor people out of poverty into the cities that you might not have as big a demographic problem
Hmm.
as other countries that didn't have that growth potential. And I'm not talking about the next year or two. China's going to have big problems. I'm talking about maybe 5, 10 years down the road. Another thing I did on a video the other day is I did some research on their population and ages, and they actually have more people in China that are under the age of 20
Hmm.
than we have total in the United States. So it is true if you take all 1.5 billion and look at it in an aggregate total that they've got a problem there. But if you
Hmm.
look at sections and if you look at the economy transitioning from poor manufacturing to kind of middle class consumerism, they could potentially dodge a bullet.
Interesting. Got another super chat here. Pedro says, George, do you foresee the SEC delisting Chinese companies from the New York Stock Exchange?
Oh, sure. I mean, I don't know that that's going to happen. I wouldn't predict that. But look at what
They
they
went
did with
full
the
woke on
Russian
Russia.
ADRs.
Yeah.
I mean, most people don't realize this, but like Luke Oil and Sberbank, which is the biggest bank in Russia, and that's their main oil company, uh, they're still trading on the Russian stock exchange. Back about when Russia first went in, they closed down their stock exchange. And everyone thinks that it's still closed today because the ADRs that you could buy as an American or a Canadian citizen, that really it's like kind of like an ETF where the underlying asset they own are those Russian shares and ruble denominated shares, but you can buy them in dollars.
Hmm.
Everyone thinks that since those are frozen and they're not being traded, that Russia's stock exchange must be closed. And that's not the case. The Russian exchange is open. They've been doing business for probably a month and a half. And a lot of those shares have probably not back to the level they were prior to the invasion, but they're up at a pretty high level. But my point was those ADRs are still frozen. So if the West, and look at this, the West was willing to freeze the assets of another country's central bank. I mean, that doesn't sound like a big deal for people who don't know macro, but that's like nuclear war. I mean, that is something that is totally unprecedented. And
Yeah.
so for the United States and the West to be willing to do that, I wouldn't put anything past them. And especially when you look at what Canada did to the truckers, you want to talk about that on an individual level when they're just going around willy nilly, just freezing bank accounts and trying to dehumanize people that have even made donations and trying to track them down and dox them and do all these things. Why wouldn't they ban U.S. citizens or delist these Chinese companies as kind of a retaliation measure? And of course, the way they'll sell that is, well, it's for your benefit, it's for your good, it's for your
For your
safety,
safety.
it's
Yeah.
for your security, and you're too stupid rich to make your own decisions. So
Mhm.
we'll just go ahead and make the decisions for you as to what you can and can't do with your money. And I think that's another thing that they'll probably use. to leverage this push towards disinformation and censorship, right? Where we have to set up a central bank digital currency because we have to know every single transaction that Canadians and Americans are making to make sure that there's no one that's funneling money to the enemy. We want to make sure that Rich Cooper isn't funneling money to Putin, or we want to make sure that George Gammon isn't funneling money to Xi Jinping. So in order to do that, they could do that if we have cash. Well, then they can do that. But if we ban cash and have a central bank digital currency, so all the transactions go through the central bank instead of Bank of America, then we can make sure that no one is funding our enemies, and we can keep you safe and secure. I think that's kind of the way they'll sell it.
Yeah, since you touched on central bank digital currencies, let's talk about that a little bit because I mean, the trend that they've been on with paper money, fiat money, whatever you want to call it, and we've seen mass adoption of the blockchain, not to the extent where like everybody has Bitcoin now, for example, which is obviously the most popular one, but it is still growing in popularity, and there's still a long way to go. What do you think the effect of central bank digital currency is going to have on the economy in the coming years when they release it? And how far off do you think they are from imposing central bank digital currency on the population?
I think we're one crisis away. So you go back, first of all, you have to understand these central bankers I think, are sociopaths, but they're also Keynesians. So they just look at everything through the lens of aggregate demand. Mm-hmm. So aggregate demand fixes everything. We can just, so if it's stimmy checks, whatever we need to do to increase aggregate demand. So you go back to 2020, and they had a real issue increasing aggregate demand directly, i.e. getting dollars into the back pocket of the average Joe and Jane that can go out there and spend it. The only way they could do it was through sending stimmy checks, and it wasn't very efficient because it had to go through the mail and the IRS and all of these different avenues, where if they would have had a central bank digital currency, which means that every single citizen would have had an account at the Fed, then all the Fed would have had to do is just credit everyone's account $5,000. And you're done. It's a far more efficient way to get dollars into the real economy, chasing goods and services. In other words, increasing aggregate demand. So I think that when we do have another financial crisis, which is just a matter of when, not if, they're going to come back in with the same standard operating procedure. And that's that we need to do QE, we need to drop rates down to back down to 0%. And we also need to come out with more stimulus. And in order to do that, we're going to use a central bank digital currency. And the average Joe and Jane is going to say, huh? What is a central bank digital? And they're probably not even going to set it up that way, Rich. They're probably just going to say, in order to get your stimmy check, what you need to do is just go to your phone and you need to download the Fed app. Mm-hmm. And then we'll give you your stimmy checks, and you can just spend the new money just with the QR code or whatever it is on your phone when you go to Starbucks or Walmart or Target or what have you. And we'll give you 1,000 Fed coins per month. And people aren't even going to ask, there's free money? Sure, let me download the Fed app. And then what that does is that gives every single person an account with the Fed automatically, just like you now have an account with B of A or Wells Fargo. And it's going to gradually transition people off of using their local bank and instead using the Fed. And then they're going to gradually, or maybe suddenly, try to wean people off of using cash. And once they've done that, then the central planners control the money supply. They control money. Therefore, like Kissinger said, they control the world. Why is that? Well, right now, the majority of the money supply is created by the commercial banking system. So if you go and get a loan, let's say for a new McLaren, and they give you a $500,000 loan, that's money that didn't exist before. The bank, your local bank, just created that. They didn't take that from someone else to give to you. That's a misconception. So that's brand new money. And let's say that the very next day the deal goes through and you're like, oh, that turned out to be a lemon. It was a salvage title, something like that. So you don't take the money, you just give it right back to the bank to pay off the entire principal. Well, then that decreases the money supply by that $500,000, all else being equal, right? So it's the commercial banks that really control the dollar. And the
Mhm.
way I usually say it is Jerome Powell doesn't control the dollar, Jamie Dimon does, meaning the banksters do, right? But if you move to a central bank digital currency, then Jerome Powell would have total control over the number of dollars that are circulating in the real economy. He would control the amount of dollars that are on the balance sheet of the non-bank entities. Therefore, he would be able to control the rate of inflation. He could just turn up the dial. He could turn down the dial. He could decrease, increase the money supply. He could increase velocity. And even more frightening, he could issue credit to whomever has political favor. Because remember, the commercial banks have a P&L, therefore they're going to lend based on your ability to pay them back. The central bank doesn't have to do that because they don't have to worry about being paid back. So they can issue credit based on your social score. They can give you an interest rate that's better if you've been a good little boy and worn your mask. But if you get caught outside on camera, as an example, walking into a Walmart and you're not social distancing, well, that's going to be deducted from your credit score. And the next time, or excuse me, your social score. And the next time you go to the bank to get a loan, you're going to have to pay 2 percentage points higher or something like that. And that's if you even get approved for the loan. And then, of course, down here in the United States, where there's Trudeau as well will really get on board with this, where they will extend credit to these groups that have political favor, right? So if you're a straight white guy, forget it. You're not getting a loan for anything at any price. But
No, you'll get a preferred rate if you're
right. But if
one
you're
of
some blue hair,
yeah.
a liberal gal or whatever, then you're going to get free money just showered upon you. And again, they can do that because they don't have to worry about being paid back. Or, if you're someone that goes on Twitter, let's say, or if you're a trucker, well, they can just completely excommunicate you from the entire banking system. And if cash is banned and you don't have any purchasing power outside of the system, you're done. You're absolutely done.
There's
And
also
you can't take that purchasing power and go down to Colombia because, again, it's trapped within the banking system. And that goes back to that Kissinger quote.
And it's coming, guys. It's not like it's not going to come. I mean, George just gave you a very simple way of how they're going to force it on the citizens of a country. And the part that he didn't touch on was like the programmability of the money. So if you've got a climate crisis, for example, and you've received your central bank digital currency and you want to go get your groceries, but you've extended your carbon credits for meat, let's say, at the checkout, when you try to check out with that steak, they may deny you the purchase of that and hand you a bag of crickets or bugs instead, because that's what you've been deemed to only be acceptable to eat at that point in time. And that might tie in your social credit. Maybe any number of ways that comes.
But carbon credit score, MasterCard has already come out with a credit card that does that. In fact, this is on the World Economic Forum's website. It's one of their corporate partners, the group that's doing this for MasterCard. And this specific card tracks your carbon score monthly based on what you buy. So if you buy more diesel fuel, if you buy more hamburger than you buy lettuce or something like that, it tracks your score there. So to your point, if you get to a certain level and the government deems that inappropriate, then they just cut you off. Or another thing they do, Rich, is if they want to increase velocity, let's say bail out the government debt. Let's say the government's at 150% debt to GDP and they need to inflate their way out and they can't create the inflation they need, like Japan. And remember, inflation is just stealing purchasing power from the poor and middle class. What they can do is they say, okay, here's your stimmy check, or here's your Fed bucks for the month. Now you've got to spend this within a week or else it disappears. And so people run out, spend it. That gets velocity increasing. That increases the rate of inflation, which again lowers the debt burden for the federal government. Although through the rate of inflation, and since people's wages don't go up at the same rate, it decreases the purchasing power of the average Joe and Jane. And that's, on a side note, that's one thing that we're seeing play out right in front of our eyes right now with the society in the United States. We are getting far, far poorer just almost every single month, because you get inflation going up at, let's just say, 8% per year. And it's a lot higher than the government would admit. But wages are only going up at 5%. So if wages are only going up at 5%, if real inflation is at 15, that's a 10% delta per year. And you compound that over 5 years, and that means people's real wages are being decreased significantly, and the government is doing that intentionally to bail themselves out so they can pay back their debt with cheaper dollars.
What is the hedge against that? Is it Bitcoin?
I think commodities are a great hedge against that. Again, I just keep beating this drum. But going back to what we're saying, I think you have to, as with the World Economic Forum and whatnot, you have to have some sort of purchasing power outside the banking system.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's one of the main reasons I like Bitcoin. I mean, long term, I'm pretty bullish. When it was up at 45, 50, 60, I was saying I'm definitely not adding to my position right now because I just saw hysteria everywhere. You know, Bitcoin's going to 1 million. You know, the cab drivers talking about it. The shoe shine boy, you know, talking about the 1920s with stocks. They're talking about it, and I don't like to buy it. So I like to wait for panic. So it's come down quite a bit now. I still would like to see a little more panic. I always tell people that my trigger to add to my position is when Michael Saylor has to sell. That'll be the capitulation
Apparently, there's
moment.
no circumstance in which they would have to sell their Bitcoin, is what he
Yes,
stated.
he says that now. We'll see. But my point there is, regardless of the price action of Bitcoin, I think you've got to own a little bit of it just to have that purchasing power outside of the banking system in case you become the next, or your group becomes the next set of truckers. I also love physical gold for that reason. And another thing that's kind of off most people's radars that's fantastic purchasing power outside of the system are Rolex watches.
Yeah.
And if you can get a good Rolex, you know, James Cameron, or, you know, if you can get the all gold Submariner, I mean, that's 40 grand of purchasing power that you can just slap on your wrist in a moment's notice and get on a flight to Argentina or something. So if you have, you know, let's say 5 of those in your bag, you got a couple $100 grand in purchasing power. That gives you a lot of flexibility and a lot of freedom and a lot of purchasing power outside of the whole Klaus, Trudeau, Biden central bank system that I think they're trying to create.
Cool. All right. Well, let's clean up these super chats and then we'll wrap up. So we've
Sure.
got Brado says our 40-year mortgage is coming. What will all that mean?
I don't know if 40-year mortgages are coming, but I think they will try to come up with schemes to prop up the housing market if it goes down in nominal terms. So right now, the game the Fed is playing is they're trying to bring down the CPI or headline CPI without increasing rates. So they sit there and talk tough like Paul Volcker, but at the end of the day, they've only increased rates to 75 basis points. And that's nothing, because they know that they can't take rates to 2%, 3% without completely crushing the economy because the debt is so high, the sovereign debt, the corporate debt, and the consumer debt. So they're trying to talk down asset prices like the stock market, like the housing market, to bring down CPI. So my point here is that the United States and most people in general, for some reason, there's this big disconnect between asset prices and consumer prices. So they like asset inflation, but they hate consumer price inflation as though they're not connected somehow, right? So my point is, even if we have higher CPI, I think they'll still try to prop up the market if nominal prices start to slide. 40-year mortgages could be a way they do that. Another thing that they're proposing in Australia right now is the government just buying a 40% equity position in your house. I don't know if you heard about that, Rich, but
no, that's new.
So if you can't afford the high prices of a house, well, instead of adding supply and letting the free market work, the government is saying, we'll buy 40% of your house right when you buy it. So we'll take a 40% equity position, and then you'll only have to make the monthly payments on 60%. And they say when housing prices go up and you decide to sell, then you can just, when you know, at the sale point, the title company, you can just pay off the government their 40% position. The government will make money, you'll make money, and you'll have these super, super low monthly payments. What they don't tell you is if prices go down, your equity position gets wiped out immediately if you can't make those mortgage payments, especially because down there all the loans are adjustable rate. So if rates go up, then who does that house go back to? goes right back to the government, and
All the
then they own all the housing stock.
all the sneaky ways the government tries to move itself into your life,
Yeah.
it's just never ending. Like, I don't
Yeah, it's
swear
like
often on the
Reagan's quote, or
cast.
was it Reagan or Milton Friedman that said, the scariest, I'm paraphrasing, but they said the scariest thing that can happen to you is when the government shows up at your front door and says, we're here to help.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're basically saying that we become a partner in your family wealth if you're going to take a 40% position in your business. I mean, I was just about to say, like, I don't swear that often in my cast, but the government can just fuck right off when it comes to getting
Yeah.
involved in our lives.
Agreed.
Is the way that I see it.
Agreed.
Ernesto says international stuff is making waves, of course, but are the economical effects of the aging boomer generations worth considering moving forward? For example, sales of their homes, stocks, etc.
Yeah, that's a great cross current that Ernesto is talking about. And we have to understand that with inflation, deflation, stocks going up or down, housing prices going up or down, there's always forces on both sides, right? There's tailwinds for the housing market. There's headwinds for the housing market. One of the main headwinds is the demographics that he's referring to. Now, a tailwind that might counter that would be the government coming in and doing one of these programs, or just universal basic income. Sure, you've got a demographic problem, but if you don't want deflation, we'll just send everybody $2,000 a month and make them spend it within 2 weeks. And you're going to have a lot of inflation, even though you've got the baby boomers retiring, right? So there's ways around that. And I think the government has looked at Japan over the last 20 years in the central banks and said to themselves, okay, what did they do wrong? Why could they not create inflation? And when you look at it, it's pretty obvious what they did wrong. And now they have the technology to make sure that doesn't happen again, especially if we have a central bank digital currency.
Okay, and we got you don't think Shanghai is intentional to slow economic growth or largest supporter of the US.
I think that's another thing that could be going on there. It's a great point, is if you want to basically have a subtle weapon against the United States and pretty much the global economy, just shut down Shanghai and shut down the port there when China supplies so many of the goods that we use in the global economy. It could be just, they're sending a shot across the bow to all these other domestic economies like the United States and the UK and the Eurozone, Australia, saying, hey, this is the power that we have. This is what we can do to your local and to local inflation in your area. And this is a big message to the politicians, because they know that that is political kryptonite. The fastest thing you can do to not get reelected is have consumer prices increase, have the price of gas go from $3 a gallon to $5. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, you're not going to vote for that guy or that gal. So this could be China's way of doing that. It could be China's way of conditioning their society to be prepared for life with fewer resources if they have to go to war. It also could be a way of China just saving face, right? Because they've got to manage 1.5 billion people, and they have this authoritarian approach, and they can't show weakness. So if you put all your eggs into the lockdown basket, if you have further spikes in the cerveza sickness, you have to go back to locking down. You can't admit that you were, or you can't not do it, because then you were admitting that you were wrong to begin with. And then if the 1.5 billion people, if they see Superman bleed, then all of a sudden maybe he's human, and you start seeing a lot of the protest, a lot of civil unrest. So that could be another component of their strategy as well, as they're just trying to save face so they can continue to take this authoritarian approach with the population.
Next one is, George, do you think the Americans-Canadian relocating to locations with lower cost of living like Colombia is a wise move, considering the upcoming economic collapse, rising inflation, and increased cost of living?
I do. I mean, that's what I'm doing in my own personal life. So I'm in Miami right now. To be honest with you, I don't like spending a lot of time here, because I know Russia has nuclear subs that are superior to our technology, probably 20 miles off the coast. The U.S. can't see. And I although that's a very, very low probability, I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I don't like being in the line of fire, so to speak. And another thing I'm very concerned with in the United States is food shortages. So that's why I like to spend time in Colombia, Medellin, where you've got all the food that's grown within probably 5 square miles of the city, where you're not in the firing line between potentially the United States and Russia. And you can just sit back from a distance, enjoy fantastic weather, fantastic food, fantastic people, women maybe more specifically, and just a great cost of living and enjoy life. And it allows me, I think, to be in a better state of mind where I can be more productive as well.
Just shout out. Jumped in on Luke. What's Luke?
Luke Oil.
Okay. Okay. And follow to that. I was told once they never get rid of cash. Politicians like bribes.
Yeah, well, it's a good point there. Yeah, again, there are a lot of different cross currents at play.
Remember, there's rules for different set of like the elites, right? So
yeah, the rules are for thee and not for me.
Yeah. Red Pill Korea. Any advice for Asian South Korean who wants to invest with dollars?
Well, again, I'd look at commodities. I'd set up an IB account with Interactive Brokers, and I'd look at some of those coal companies. I'd look at the Sprott Uranium Trust. I would look at, let's see, dollar. I mean, if you want dry powder, you're probably best to go into T-bills, just short term and roll them over. And then maybe wait for dollar assets to get cheaper, like the stock market, if we have a recession. That's probably what I would do. I mean, that's what I'm doing in my own portfolio. Is I have a much larger cash position than I usually have. I still have some real estate, still have hard assets and whatnot, but there's a large portion of my portfolio that's just straight cash. And although I'm losing purchasing power to the stuff that I can buy in the United States, I think that I'm going to be gaining purchasing power, just kind of placing a bet that we go through a recession in the next 18 months and stock prices go down to a point where there's panic in the market and I can get them on the cheap.
Got it. Okay, and then these will be the last two, so no more super chats, guys. Brado says, how long can they still prop up the housing until the crash? Can they prevent such a crash indefinitely with the programs you mentioned?
Not indefinitely, because at some point in time, there's no free lunch. You got to pay the fiddler. But if you look at Canada, if you look at all the crazy programs they've come out with in Australia, I mean, I don't see why the United States can't do the exact same thing. And especially if the Fed starts issuing debt right and mortgages, on their balance sheet where they don't have to worry about being paid back. I definitely think they've got more tools in the central bank bag to try to prop up the housing market. Will it work? I don't know. We'll have to see.
All right. And then the last one before we wrap up, Tim says, just sold my home and bought 50 acres of land in the country. Nice. I have 130,000 in the bank and was planning to use that plus 200K mortgage to build a home. Would you recommend holding off the building and building a shop/house cash debt free?
Yeah, it depends on how secure your income is. So if you've got a super steady source of income that's recession proof and you're positive that you can make that mortgage payment, it might make sense. But the thing where I hesitate there is you could get stuck if your income gets put on hold. Now you've got this mortgage payment and you're buying a property that doesn't necessarily cash flow. If your property, like if you had an Airbnb or a bed and breakfast on the property, I would like that a lot more because then you're paying off the mortgage with other people's money, meaning that cash flow that's being produced by the asset itself. So I would prefer that, but I'm not going to tell you not to do it because it's a great plan B. It just depends on how secure your income stream is.
Awesome. George, it's been an absolute pleasure and slice to have this conversation with you, to let you red pill my audience on some ideas around money and the economy and what you see going on. If you guys like George's take on things, go and subscribe to his YouTube channel, George Gammon, and his other YouTube channel, Rebel Capitalist. This is all he talks about. He also holds events, in real life events, so you can check those out as well.
Yeah, Rebel Capitalist Live is the next one. It's Miami, June 24th to the 26th. And we got Doug Casey, we got Kiyosaki's going to be there, Jeff Snyder, Brent Johnson. It's going to be a blast. So you guys can check it out at rebelcapitalistlive.com.
Anything else you wanted to shout out to before we wrap up?
No, that's it. I appreciate you having me on, Rich. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I can't wait to get you down to one of my events or a mastermind group and say hello face to face, grab a beer, and talk cars.
We'll do it, brother. We'll do it soon.